Well, actually, I just wanted to say a few words of introduction, and then we can fire away. Let's just say who we have. Let me allow us to say who we have. And we'll just start with Mike Alvarez. As I mentioned before, professor of political science at Caltech and the co-director of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project. He's done a lot of research in public opinion, elections, et cetera. I think relevant to this conference, one thing that's notable is that he's a editor of a book entitled Confirming Elections, Creating Confidence and Integrity Through Election Auditing. We have Dylan Lynch, directly to his right, who's a policy associate focusing on elections with the National Conference of State Legislatures. Jennifer Morrell, who's right over here, is currently consultant with the Democracy Fund on election auditing issues. Before then, she ran elections in Utah and Colorado. And if you want a really good story, and if you don't know it yet, ask her how she got to first run elections in Utah. It's an interesting one. And then Philip Stark, professor of statistics at the University of California, Berkeley, where he's formerly chaired the statistics department and is currently an associate dean. Having been an associate dean, my condolences to you.
Being chair.
He's worked in many areas, including elections, and he's well known for helping to develop the technique that's known as risk limiting audits. And so that's who we have up here to begin with. And why don't we go quasi alphabetically? Why don't we start with Mike? We'll end up with Dylan because I think that would be a good place to end. But why don't we start with Mike?
Okay, I'm going to stand up just because it's early, and if I sit, I'm going to probably fall back asleep. I always like it. I tease Charles about this quite frequently because whenever we have invitations to do conferences on the East Coast, they always seem to make the guy from the West Coast go first because it's like 6:25 my time. But I wanted to welcome everybody here just quickly. I mean, this is a very exciting event. As Charles has said, this has been in the works for quite some time. We've been planning this for a long time, and we're really excited that we're now in a position to host this event. It's great to see everybody in the room. It's just fantastic to see the interest in this area. And I would encourage you, the one thing I think is really exciting about what the Caltech MIT Technology Project has managed to do over the years is to engage election officials, stakeholders, experts interested in elections, and academics, and bring everybody together in events like this. And so I would encourage you, you know, as an academic, I'm going to try to meet as many of the election officials as I can and others and try to stay away from just hanging out with my academic friends. I would encourage the election officials and others to do the same. The academics in this room are some really fantastic folks. They're all very excited and committed to helping you as part of their research. So I would encourage everybody to try to maybe get to know someone new over the course of the next 2 days. So in any case, the current status. How do I move forward? Okay, I will be talking about this project a little bit more, I think, tomorrow morning. We've been doing an interesting pilot project with Neil Kelly in Orange County on trying to figure out a series of methods for comprehensive election audits. And again, I'll talk about that tomorrow. One of the things that we have in California now is counties can experiment with risk limiting audits. And Neil actually, in the aftermath of our June primary, had the first pilot risk limiting audit in Orange County. Second, excuse me? Okay, well, I stand corrected. It was the second one. But this was the first one that I went to.
So it begins at birth.
That's right. So it was the second one. Thank you for the correction. But it was really interesting to witness it and see it and to really see it in person as they struggled to implement this really exciting technology, but a complicated procedure. The coolest part, of course, was the dice that they use to generate the random numbers. But you know, again, it was really interesting to see them struggle through selecting the ballots and figuring out how to scroll through the voter verified paper audit trail to find the right ballots and count them. It was, again, they're inventing a procedure, and it's really interesting to watch as that process happens. So I just thought I'd throw some photos up. Okay, so in terms of the goals for the conference, at least from my perspective, and I hope Charles shares this perspective as well, and Ron and Philip too. But from my perspective, really what I'm trying to get out of this conference over the next 2 days are a few key goals. One of them is to really kind of get some clarity in terms of the terminology. There's a lot of terminology that we'll all use and we'll sort of fling around, but maybe outside this room, there's a lot of ambiguity about what some of these concepts are and how they differ. And I do think at some point we all need to work on better educating stakeholders in the public as to what the difference is between, say, a ballot audit and a recount, between fixed ballots and risk-limiting audits, between ballot audits, procedural audits, and comprehensive audits. And so again, we'll hear a lot of discussion about these various things over the next 2 days. And again, I do think that one of the key outcomes of this, hopefully, will be a little bit of clarification in terms of some of the key terminology. The second thing is that procedures, in particular when we focus on audits, vary enormously across the states. There's a huge amount of complication in terms of how different states implement these different kinds of procedures. We'll hear more about some of the details. I actually borrowed some of these numbers from the NCSL. Most states have some kind of fixed audit procedure, but those vary enormously across the states. A few states actually now require risk-limiting audits. Some are experimenting with them as well, like in California, so we'll see more evolution in that direction in California. But exactly how these are implemented across the states vary dramatically, and providing some of that information and really trying to better understand how the practices vary, but also moving forward towards developing some best practice procedures for all of these different auditing mechanisms, I think would be a really wonderful outcome of this project. Third, I think we all understand and have different goals for why we conduct these post-election ballot audits. I think, again, this is more on the academic side, but clarifying some of that I think is an important goal. Really trying to understand the costs in particular, right, to election officials as they proceed with really complicated post-election procedures in a very short period of time, I think is a very important issue for many of us to grapple with, is how can we, again, implement these post-election ballot audits in an efficient and timely manner during that very limited window we have after an election to try to square all these things away. And also studying a little bit more, how effective are they at different types of auditing mechanisms, at finding different types of problems, either administratively or technologically, problems in the data, which again is something that I'll talk about more, how they serve as a deterrent to fraud, how they improve voter confidence. But again, I think the bottom line that we haven't talked a lot about, at least on the academic side, is the time that ballot audits in particular, but also other forms of comprehensive auditing, the time and the resources that they take are pretty considerable. And I've seen this with my own eyes in the project that we've worked on in Orange County. I'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow. We've tried to stay out of Neil Kelly's hair as much as possible, but that is very difficult when you're putting a lot of demands on him and his staff for data, questions, and providing them feedback in as near real time as we can manage. So that's another goal. And I will talk a little bit more about sort of my, I think what I'm really interested in later, I think tomorrow morning, which is comprehensive performance audits. I think the post-election ballot audits are an important tool. States need to do them, counties need to do them. It's a very, very important mechanism. But they may miss certain problems in aspects of election administration and in the data behind, as Charles said, the key inputs going into an election. Things like voter registration, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we've been working to audit voter registration files, ballot design, polling place problems, all sorts of other issues that might arise. And how moving more towards an end-to-end kind of audit procedurally and a comprehensive audit is really going to help us further confirm the outcomes of elections. So again, from my perspective, a key goal is to talk with many of you about what we've been doing, get your feedback, and perhaps see if we can't solicit some additional participation in this project moving forward into 2020 with some more of our election officials around the country. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Who's next?
I think we're going to
Jennifer. Okay.
Jennifer.
You want this?
Yes.
Here you go.
I guess I'll try to stand to the side as well. I move a lot, so I'll try to stay put.
Watch the crutches.
Or I might end up with a set myself.
Yeah, I have another pair.
This is actually really exciting to be here. So, so much so, we've been talking about audits for a long time now. Every time I come to a meeting such as this, a gathering of election officials, or I meet with state and local officials at their own conferences, the topic seems to come up more and more now. And so it's exciting to sit in a room of individuals who all feel that same sort of passion and dedication to making that happen. I just want to start. I'm going to take a little bit different stance today, and I want to talk more today about implementation. You're going to hear a lot over today and tomorrow about different types of audits, things that we might want to consider, but I want to step back and think about this from the perspective of an election official. I've had the privilege over the last 10 years of running local elections at both the city and the county level, and for about a year and a half in Colorado, I got the chance to really dive in and to think about risk-limiting audits. It was exceptional because we really were starting from scratch, trying to understand, at least for myself and my staff, really what the terminology meant and how to interpret that into the processes that we were doing every day. Trying to think about the way that we handled and stored and organized ballots, think about the way that we tracked those and reconciled those and ensured that there was a solid chain of custody. Thinking about how we could communicate the processes that we were doing and how we could communicate the audit that was taking place to the public in a way that was meaningful. And that's more difficult than you think because it's a very complex sort of idea. And so when I got to the end of that all in November, December of 2017, I was amazed at the number of phone calls and requests that I was getting from individuals and other election organizations wanting to know how we did what we did and if we could share our guidelines and our best practices. But what occurred to me through all of that was that as fantastic as the risk-limiting audit was and valuable in providing a way to sort of validate the way that the voting system tabulated votes, it occurred to me that there were a lot of other critical steps throughout the election process that we probably ought to be looking closer at. In our office, we employed a number of checklists to make sure that we were doing things correctly, but quite often we didn't go back after the election to sort of audit or review that all of those checks had been made and all of those things had been done. And so I sort of, through the generosity of the Democracy Fund, decided to take on this project to think about how we can use audits and standards and tests to further validate and increase trust in elections. Most of my time this year has been spent focused solely on risk-limiting audits. But what I want to talk about is if we decide as an election community, as technologists and the academic community, that we want to move elections more into this realm of auditing, how do we implement that on a wide scale? It's probably more challenging than even I recognize, and I've spent about 7 months now out in the field talking to local officials to understand what their challenges are and the information that they're looking for in order to do this. So the first thing that keeps coming to mind over and over again is we need to figure out how to clear away the clutter. I will tell you, as a local election official, first of all, we usually wear more than one hat. So elections might not be our sole primary duty. And as you look at states where you have municipal clerks running elections, that becomes even more so. They're functioning in 10 different capacities, and elections just happens to be one of those things. Coupled with the fact that all of you are getting very prolific at publishing and writing and sharing and emailing things that we need to be doing or be aware of. And that can be a challenge. And so how do we clear away the clutter? How do we take what's important and sort of boil it down to the essence of what it is that needs to be done or performed? Well, I like to think about it like making bread. I love to make bread. I talk about this a lot. I've spent many days with people teaching my children and my friends and family how to do this too. I love to grind my own wheat, make all types of bread, different varieties. But I realize that when we talk about implementing a process, there are a lot of similarities and a lot of things that we can learn. First of all, what are the principles? When you think about bread making, right, it's important to understand the interaction of yeast and salt and proofing and different principles. Election officials want to know that. They want to understand when we're talking about risk-limiting audits, they want to understand what the terms mean. They want to understand what they look like and how to define them and how they interact with one another. So laying a foundation and sort of teaching the principles is really, really critical to sort of getting this off and going. What tools are available? If you think again about making bread, right? We have mixers and we have grinders and we have different things, measuring tools, scales, things like that, proofing drawers at our disposal. How do they work and how do they help enhance the process? When are they essential and when are they just a nice to have? The same I found is true when we start talking about risk limiting audits. We need to have tools that are available to make this as easy as we can and to automate this as much as we can. And I realize automate could be I saw that look, Philip. But there are like some complex mathematical calculations. Yes, complex. In determining the sample size and determining when the risk limit has been met, that if we can provide a piece of software or a tool to assist in that, it will help ensure that it's done correctly and done with efficiency. Next, we want to provide some sort of really measured, defined list of things to do, just like you would with any recipe. And so having a checklist, having a detailed step-by-step list of guidelines for how to create a ballot manifest, how to organize your ballots, how to walk through the process, even though each state and jurisdiction is going to be slightly different, right? They're going to have their own little flavor, just like you would with bread. You're going to make it your own and you're going to adapt it to your climate and conditions and humidity and things like that. Having that foundation is really important. And then the one that I think we miss, and this is where I think those of you sitting here are critical, having somebody to come in and demonstrate and then mentor. Sometimes it's easy to rush in and say, this is how you need to do it, and then we move on to the next state or the next county that needs our help. But figuring out a way to put states and jurisdictions together to help mentor one another, to help provide guidance and cheerleading for one another, I think is the last step that's valuable and critical to this being successful. So I'm working on a set of a report, I guess. I was hoping it would be done by this conference, but it's still a work in progress. Hopefully we'll see that rolled out at the end of next month by NAS and NASED. But the idea is to sort of take those same principles that I just talked about and put them into a report for state and local officials, explaining what's the purpose of auditing, what is a risk limiting audit, and providing some of the foundation that has been set by the scholars and others in a way that is applicable. So providing examples. What does this look like? How does it work? How does this affect me in my environment? What are the policy considerations? So there's so many things that have surprised me, but none more so than the discussion of recounts and how that interacts with risk limiting audits. Do we change our recount law? Do we keep our recount law? Is there a way that an RLA could replace a recount? When does the recount start? When does the audit start? When do we touch our ballots? We can't touch our ballots. So there are a lot of policy considerations that need to go into that thought process. Some of the other things that the report addresses is technology. Preparing for the audit, conducting the audit, and then some of the things that kind of end up at the end that we often get overlooked, like feedback, discussion about what did we learn, what can we do better, how do we follow up on that, and then communication. How do we share with the public, how do we share with our candidates what it is that we're doing in a way that they can understand it and we don't overwhelm them with all of the details. Okay, I'm going to move quick, but I do want to just touch on where are the gaps. And these are some of the things I think we need to be talking about in the breaks and in the interim today. Communication. Again, this is a complex idea, and I think some of these other things that we're going to talk about in terms of ballot layout and design, auditing voter registration databases, how do we communicate what it is that we are accomplishing with our constituents? In terms of the RLA, thinking about a universal audit tool. This is probably the most critical thing I think we all need to tackle next, is how do we provide states and locals something that they can use to perform most of these calculations in the background. Retrieving ballots, we're getting better at that, but it still seems to be a little bit tricky, especially in a precinct scanned environment. So working out better, more efficient ways to do that. And then still, again, dealing with the issue of voter anonymity Again, when we scan ballots at the precinct level, as we've discovered in some of these pilots, most state and local officials want to do a ballot level comparison audit, but we're struggling with how do we do that and keep that voter secrecy or voter anonymity. And then this one too, who sets the standards? I've been asked this so many times. If there's a tool, how do I know that the tool is working well? Who's going to ensure that it's secure? If there's a standard type of audit, who says what that is? And how do I know that that's the audit that I need to follow? When we talk about pseudorandom number generators, I just got asked this, who controls that? Who tells me that I'm using the right public PRNG? And where does it come from? So who sets these standards? Election officials want to know that before they adopt this. They want to be able to take some definitive body, some authority from somebody else so that they can say, we are following the standards prescribed by X. One of the most interesting questions I got asked, I'm going to skip a few things because I know I'm running out of time. In New Jersey, we did something really interesting. We just did thanks to Bob Giles, we did a risk limiting audit pilot in New Jersey, and we decided to bring in their auditors from their state comptroller's office. And they said to me, so, what are the auditing standards that we're following? Or what set of guidelines, whose principles do you use when you go out and do election audits? And I said, that's a great question. All right, so I'm going to just kind of move forward a little bit. I just do want to talk very briefly about auditing itself because I think it's important. I think this convening is important because I think we need to audit more than just the voting system. I think there are other critical components, and I think that auditing provides us a ton of value. It provides us a way to detect errors. It provides accountability. It deters fraud. It limits risk. It assures accuracy. And most importantly, it provides feedback. And so you think about states and locals now employing so many different experts, right? We bring in legal teams. We bring in cybersecurity teams. We work with project managers. We all have social media and communication experts now helping us with our Twitter feed. How many election offices employ an auditor or work with an independent auditor or somebody that's a specialist in quality control? I think that's something that we need to start thinking about. I have learned so much about what an audit is, different types of audits, their value, phases of the audit. We don't have to reinvent this. Auditors have been doing this for a long time. We just need to figure out how to translate this into the work that we do as election officials. Internal and external audits. This, I think, is critical. I think election officials want and need a way to measure their own strengths and weaknesses internally against the procedures they have and against external standards. But I also think they want that validity that comes with bringing in some sort of third party or independent audit team. And I love, again, what we tried in New Jersey because that was free. It didn't cost anything, I think. Have they sent you a bill? They're already there. They're familiar with the state. They're independent. They know the counties. They know the jurisdictions. And they were so willing to offer that service to election officials. Why we've never thought about that before, I don't know, because I think it's a brilliant idea. Why do we audit elections? I just extrapolated those same sort of core ideas that I got from the auditors I've been talking with, and it really just seems to make sense that using audit principles will solve a lot of the things that we've been grappling with. All right, I usually end most of my conversations with this statement that we are at our best when we face challenges together. And I decided to add in the word complex and kind of end on this note about working together. I think collaboration really is going to be the key to solving some of the issues that we're faced with. Not just in helping officials plan and check for resource allocation, the way their voting system worked, the way ballots were laid out, whether the voter registration database is accurate, whether their logic and accuracy tests are working, whether ballot chain of custody, whatever it is, it's going to take the collaboration of all of us. And I'm going to say something frank because I've been now on both sides. I've been the election official who sometimes is wary of the academic or the technologist or the advocacy group that's knocking on their door. Don't be. I've gotten to know some of these folks really, really well, and their heart is in the right place, and the intent is good, and they've got a lot of phenomenal ideas and resources. But then I will point to all of you and say, election officials are overwhelmed, under-resourced, usually lacking in the staff with the skills and abilities and things that they need to do some of the tests and implement some of the ideas that you all have. Also, their time is short, and when you bombard them with emails and phone calls and long visits and conference calls week after week after week, it can start to feel a bit much. And so we really need to figure out a way that we can work together better. And I think if we can come up with something similar to like the report I talked about, some way to boil down what it is that we're trying to accomplish, provide the tools, provide the templates, provide kind of a practical guide to the things that need to be done, I think it will be a win for everybody.
Thanks. Philip.
So I'd also like to come back in about 2 hours when I wake up, but we'll see what happens. These are not particularly good slides, and I think I might just ramble a little bit instead. First, about the history of risk-limiting audits, and something that Michael said made me feel that it's important to spell out that the dichotomy is not between fixed size audits and risk-limiting audits. There are other ways of auditing that are sensitive to the margin, that have variable workloads. What distinguishes a risk-limiting audit is something a little bit different. Whoops, probably a little too big. Okay.
Yeah, hit Control L.
Woohoo, okay.
Life hack, Control L.
Somehow I accidentally, it's strange to be here. Unlike all these other people who are saying, it's so exciting, it's so, I'm like, this is weird. I got interested in auditing in 2007 when I was on then California Secretary of State Deborah Bowen's post-election audit standards working group, the PSWIG. Our job was to look at what other states were doing for auditing and try to figure out what the state of the art was and what California should be doing. And at that time, the state of the art in academic research, so the state of the art in state laws was fixed size audits. You look at some fraction of precincts, you count them by hand, and you say what you see. California's like that. You look at 1% of precincts, you count them by hand, you compare them, and you're done. No obligation to do anything extra if you find problems. Basically, the audits they looked at something, but they didn't really accomplish much as far as I could tell. The academics who were working on that, some of whom are in this room, Ron and Mark and whatnot, the paradigm that people were looking at was a detection paradigm. They were saying, instead of looking at a fixed size sample, why don't we adjust the size of the sample so that if the election outcome is wrong, we have a big probability of finding at least one error in the tally. And so they were looking at how many precincts do you need to hand count so that if there's enough error to wipe out the margin and cause the wrong candidate or position to appear to win, you have a big chance of finding at least one error. And the problem I saw with that was if you're talking about hand-marked paper ballots, in any sample of a reasonable size, you will find at least one case where the machine didn't interpret the vote correctly. So then what do? You have a new election? So it felt like that still wasn't quite answering the right question. And what felt to me like the right question was, in light of what I've seen in the audit, how confident am I that the election outcome is correct, or the contest outcomes are correct? And then finally, the final kind of shift was, what we'd really like to do is know that at the end of the audit, we have high confidence that the outcome is right. So how can you do that if in fact the outcome might be wrong? Well, you have to have the possibility that the audit will continue to a full hand count and overturn the preliminary reported result by correcting it with a hand count. So that, in essence, is what a risk-limiting audit is about. There are other ways of trying to adjust things to the margin. There's Bayesian audits, which I'll talk about really briefly. Ron will talk about more later. But the fundamental idea here is we want to audit in such a way that when we're done, we have high confidence that the reported outcomes are right, which might involve replacing the reported outcomes with a hand count. The first pilot audits were done in California in 2008, in I think the spring and summer. There were about a dozen pilot audits, or audits in about a dozen counties in California by 2013, including one in Orange County and a number of other counties. By now there have been statewide audits in Colorado now twice. Was it the third time? It was the third time. Great time. Yeah, I can't count either. There have been probably something approaching 20 in California. New Jersey and Michigan are, I guess, the most recent. Virginia and Indiana? Is that? Yep. Okay. And Denmark. Go figure. Thanks to Karsten Sherman. So you kind of, a lot of this stuff is worked out. The math is worked out for auditing contests of all different kinds, from plurality contests, first past the post, majority contests, supermajority contests, proportional representation contests like you have for Parliament or something like that. IRV, although nobody's actually audited an IRV using these methods in practice yet. So the kind of vote for K, like school board contests and whatnot. Sort of the math is worked out for a variety of ways of doing the sampling and so forth. But as Jennifer mentioned, the logistical details on the ground really matter. And one of the things that really impressed me when I was first getting going in this was visiting a dozen different counties in California and I think 4 or 5 counties in Colorado, and trying to get an idea of how local elections officials deal with their paper, how they organize it, how they scan ballots, how they batch the ballots, what is the technology on the ground they're doing, and what is the easiest approach for them. What's the smallest lift to get them to a point where they can do an audit in a way that will confirm the tabulation of the votes? So an audit isn't any better than the paper trail it uses, and my big focus largely has been on the tabulation audit side of it. But by the same token, an audit is just theater unless you're auditing against a reliable, trustworthy paper trail. So if you don't have a paper trail, there's no point. You're not going to get off the ground. If your paper trail isn't verifiable, and these days some ballot marking devices are in that category, produces a paper trail, but there's no opportunity for the voter to verify it, or in practice it's very difficult to do, then the audit maybe can verify that the paper was tabulated correctly, but that's not really verifying who won. It's verifying something else. And if the paper trail isn't trustworthy, then there's no reason that the audited outcome would be trustworthy. And I think we need a lot of work on regulations and laws around securing the paper trail, auditing, et cetera. All right, so I had 3 C's of election integrity. They expanded to 5 yesterday somehow, which was a bad idea. So the first is to create a durable, tamper-evident, voter-verified paper trail, right? We need paper ballots. We need to vote on paper. I think that the best technology for that right now for most voters is hand-marked paper. I think there's an important role for ballot marking devices. This is a big debate that's been going on the EVN list and elsewhere. But it's certainly true that if a system can put marks on your ballot after you've let go of it, after you've put it into the system, then it is no longer a voter-verified ballot. And there are some BMDs that do that. So those are just bad design. If you're using a ballot marking design, you're basically making the voter responsible for checking part of the technology, for checking whether the ballot marking device altered voter intent before recording it on the paper. With hand-marked paper ballots, the voter's responsible for his or her own errors, but an auditor cannot check whether the paper correctly records the voter's intent. So if you're relying on technology to do that, the voter can't pass that job on to the auditors. Second C is to care for the paper record, and this is where I think we really kind of fall short nationally on standards and regulations and so forth. You need verifiable chain of custody, 2-person custody rules, ballot accounting, good seal protocols, all these things. It's a wonderful anecdote from a meeting, I think it was in Chicago, probably 7 or 8 years ago, Roger Johnston, who did physical security for Argonne National Labs, dealing with nuclear material and things like that, goes to his local election official to try to understand the physical security around ballots, box of ballots, security tape, all, blah, 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 seals, so forth. You flip it over and you can open the box from the bottom. There's no seals on the bottom, right? So really working on this stuff, using seals that are hard to defeat or tamper with. Matt Bernard has an example of defeating the seals on some voting equipment relatively recently with a piece of a Dr. Pepper can. There are a lot of places where we need improvement. Compliance audit. So this is back to the kind of process stuff that Jennifer was talking about. What we really need before the audit starts, before the tabulation audit starts, is to confirm that the audit is an audit of a trustworthy record. And that it's not automatic, it's not guaranteed. One of the things that Harvey pushes out a lot is auditing eligibility, eligibility determinations. Do people get the right ballots, were the right ballots included in the canvas? But there's a lot of other things to do. Voting checks at ballot accounting, checks against the voter registration database, poll books, et cetera, chain of custody logs, and all of these other things. And these are not uniformly routine across the country. The fourth C is to check the reported outcome against the paper. This is the tabulation audit, but again, if you're doing it against an untrustworthy paper trail, what's the point? And then finally, to correct the outcome if it's wrong. And this is the distinguishing characteristic between risk limiting audits and some other stuff, that they have, that they, with high probability, continue to a full hand count to correct the outcome if the reporting outcome was wrong. And wrong means disagrees with what an accurate full hand count would show. Okay, so what is a risk limiting audit? It is not a single procedure. It is a property that some procedures have. And this is where people get really confused. They say something like, I can't do a risk limiting audit in my state because I don't have Colorado's equipment. Well, there are lots and lots of ways to do it. If you have paper and you keep track of the paper, you can do a risk limiting audit. It might involve looking at more pieces of paper than if you had different equipment, but you can still do it. So what's the property? If an accurate full count of the paper would find different winners than were reported, the procedure has a known minimum chance of leading to a full hand count, which corrects the outcome. That's the essential thing. That makes a risk limiting audit risk limiting. The risk that it's limiting is the risk of certifying an outcome that's wrong, right? What's the risk limit? It's the largest chance that you don't correct the outcome if the outcome is wrong. The starting sample size, people worry about this a lot, and a lot of the discussion prior to about 2008 was, how big a sample do I need? And the answer is, you don't know until you start looking, because you don't know how many errors you're going to find. You don't know how far you have to go to get strong evidence that the reported outcome is correct. So what really matters for the purpose of limiting risk is when you stop, not when you start. Okay, let me go back just one other, I just lost my train of thought. Maybe it'll come back to me. Okay, so another kind of audit that is sensitive to the margin, that has the potential of continuing to a full hand count, and that isn't a fixed size audit, is a Bayesian audit, and Ron is going to talk about them more later, but I want to draw a distinction between them. So a risk limiting audit, what is the key idea? If the outcome is wrong, the audit has a known minimum chance of correcting it. There's no assumption about voter preferences. There's a bunch of ballots, you don't make any assumptions about what's on them. You let them speak to you through what you see in the sample. There's no assumption about how people vote. There's no assumption that they go into the polling booth and randomly decide who to vote for or something like that. And the question that a risk limiting audit answers is a question about this election. What is the evidence that this particular election, this particular collection of ballots was tabulated accurately enough to determine who really won? So an audit is not going to tell you down to the last ballot how many votes people got. That's a very, very high standard. Back to Jennifer's comment about financial auditing and the fact that there's a whole industry around that, there's a notion in financial auditing of a material difference or material error. And the I think, legal threshold for materiality is, would an informed decision maker have made a different decision if he or she had known the true value of this number rather than the value that was reported? And because that's such an amorphous concept, it tends to get translated into a percentage and say, did it make a 10% difference? And if it didn't make a 10% difference, it isn't material. So in elections, we have a much nicer standard for materiality. Was it big enough to change the outcome? It's a really nice, bright line standard compared to what they have in financial auditing, which is much kind of murkier. All right. Okay. Bayesian audit. So Bayesian audits are about a hypothetical population of elections in which voter preferences are random and follow some known distribution. And what a Bayesian audit does is asks among elections that are generated at random like this, for which the audit results match the actual audit results, what percentage of them have an outcome different from the outcome that was reported in this election. It assumes that voters have random preferences. It assumes a particular probability distribution for voter preferences. It answers a question about a hypothetical population of elections. That said, if you put the right probability distribution on voter preferences, the upset probability, the chance that the wrong person was reported to be the winner, is numerically equal to the risk of a risk-limiting audit. But in general, those least favorable distributions aren't known, and in general, the upset probability that a Bayesian audit gives you is smaller than the frequentist risk, than the risk limit. So it's answering a very different question. It's holding different things constant. In a risk-limiting audit, this pile of ballots is constant, and you think about what might have happened had you drawn different audit samples. In a Bayesian audit, these audit results are held constant, and you think about what would have happened had you had different elections, had you had different piles of ballots that you were auditing. Okay, both of these approaches require a trustworthy paper trail, random sampling, and a lot of the same things. The big difference is the rule and when you can stop the audit. So in a risk-limiting audit, you stop if, on the assumption that the outcome is wrong, the audit data are sufficiently unlikely. So that's if the audit casts sufficient doubt on, it provides sufficiently strong evidence that the outcome is right, you stop. In a Bayesian audit, you stop if it's unlikely that an election generated in this particular way that matched the audit data was one of the elections in which the outcome was wrong. So it's about, again, it's answering a slightly different question. Okay, I'm going to go back to general things. So these are common to both Bayesian audits and risk-limiting audits. So one of the important things that makes really big difference across how different jurisdictions handle their paper, how different states regulations and so forth, is the sampling scheme. How do you sample ballots? How do you look at these things? So first of all, technically, there's no need to sample anything. A full hand count is a risk-limiting audit with a risk limit of 0, an accurate full hand count, right? That has a high probability of correcting the outcome if the outcome is wrong. You don't have to do any statistics. Moreover, this is a kind of wonky technical thing, but if I wanted to have a risk-limiting audit with a risk limit of, say, 5%, I could just generate a random number between 1 and 100, and if the number is 95 or less, I do a full hand count. And if the number is 96 to 100, then I just leave the result alone. That has, at most a 5% chance of not correcting a wrong outcome. It's just a waste of time most of the time, right? So instead of that, we collect evidence by looking at some ballots, right? So the problem is not limiting risk. The problem is being efficient, right? The problem is how do you minimize the amount of paper that you have to touch in order to get strong evidence that the outcome is right. So the sampling unit can be batches of ballots, such as precincts or ballots scanned by a particular machine, or individual ballots. The most efficient methods are based on looking at individual ballots. Most efficient means touch the least paper. It doesn't mean most efficient in terms of the setup you need to do to get ready for the audit. We're talking about what happens on audit day. You can stratify the sample or not. What's a stratified sample? So a stratified sample might be different counties draw their own samples on their own. Independently. That's a stratified sample. Each county is a stratum. A stratified sample might be, I'm going to draw some vote-by-mail ballots, and I'm going to draw some ballots cast in precinct on election day. That's a stratified sample. Though it turns out that dividing things into these non-overlapping piles decreases the statistical efficiency of methods. And it may increase or decrease the logistical complexity of implementing the audit depending on how things go. It may be really helpful because, for instance, you could start auditing vote-by-mail ballots before you have other stuff tabulated. So there are lots of strategic reasons you might want to do this, but it complicates some things. It complicates the math, and it generally results in having to touch more paper. You can sample the sampling units with equal or unequal probability. In a seminal paper, Ron and the Poisson, your probability proportional to error-bound. Yep. Looked at drawing batches of ballots with probability proportional basically to their size or to a bound on how much error could be hidden in the batch of ballots. That carries down as well to ballot level auditing. It can increase the statistical efficiency, but it's a more complicated procedure to implement, and it's less transparent. It gets more confusing. You can draw your sample with replacement, meaning you pull a ballot out, you put it back in, you draw again, maybe get the same ballot, maybe not. Without replacement, there's Bernoulli sampling. We have a paper about to come out on that, where basically you toss a coin for each ballot to decide whether to use it in the sample or not. Poisson sampling in that paper that Ron wrote, and so on. The simulation that people are going to do this afternoon using cards and dice to do an audit is going to use sampling with replacement and ballot level. Okay. What do you do with the sample once you have it? There's lots of different ways to use it to try to control the risk. One of them is polling, which is basically like an exit poll. In an exit poll, you try to ask a random sample of people how they voted, and you use that to try to get an idea of what the ballots, what the vote ought to look like if you counted everything. In a polling audit, what you do is look at what the ballots say. You don't compare it to anything. You just look for, in some sense, whether you get a sufficiently large majority for the winner in a sufficiently large sample that would be really implausible if somebody else had won or if it had been a tie. Comparison audit involves comparing how the machine interpreted an individual ballot or batch of ballots to how human readers interpret that ballot or batch of ballots. So that tends to be more efficient statistically. It tends to be a lot more work up front in the setup cost. It makes higher demands on the equipment, on data export from the voting system, so forth and so on. So the simplest thing right now that we know how to do is a ballot polling audit with sampling with replacement, and that's what you guys are going to look at this afternoon. So acronym soup. There are a lot of names out there. They have to do with the way the risk is calculated, the way the sample is drawn, the way that the data are used once you have them. Bravo is a method for ballot polling. So this is joint work with Mark, and that was also with Mike? No, I can't remember who. One of my students, yeah. It's a ballot polling method. Kaplan-Markov, Kaplan-Wall, Kaplan-Kolmogorov, these are ways for doing ballot-level comparison audits where you compare how the machine interpreted a ballot and how a human does. SWEET is a relatively new thing that was just tested in Michigan and was actually developed for Colorado. That's a way to do stratified audits where you do ballot-level comparison for, well, first it's a way to do stratified audits generally, but in particular what it lets you do is combine polling for some ballots with comparison for other ballots. BBP is Bernoulli ballot polling. That's going to come out pretty soon. SPRT is Wald sequential probability ratio test. That's the basis of Bravo and some of these other methods. But anyway, if anybody's curious about more details, I'm happy to talk to anyone. I'm happy to do demonstrations and reward those who are interested with jelly beans that Mark brought. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Phil. Right. Dylan.
Great. I'm going to stay seated because I have my notes here and it's going to help keep me on track and hopefully on time. I know that's usually an impossible thing to do at a conference, but I will do my best. So as I was introduced, my name is Dylan Lynch with the National Conference of State Legislatures. I'm a policy associate, and my expertise is election administration, which, of course, post-election audits falls under. Prior to NCSL, just to give a little background, I interned for the Iowa Secretary of State in their elections division. I also got a master's degree in public administration and also clerked for a session in the Iowa House. So I hope to bring a somewhat different perspective, and I think that helps me a lot in my job to kind of have seen many sides of the angle here. So for those unfamiliar with NCSL or who are foggy in what we do, we serve the 7,383 legislators and 25,000 legislative staff across the country, all 50 states, and also all the territories. I'm still waiting for one of the island territories to call and say they need an election expert to show up. So if someone can make that happen, I'm on board. So we do that by providing nonpartisan research and analysis on state policies. We do not recommend policies. We do not take any positions on policies, and we also do not do any draft or model legislation at all either. One of the other big things we do is we link legislators with each other and also with experts. I see many people, such as Jennifer here, Maurice, Josh, and Matt up there, who have helped us in that endeavor to bring expertise to fill in some gaps or to expand on what we know as an organization as well. And then our DC office speaks on behalf of state legislatures at the Congress level. And so, as you might imagine, we have to cover vast policy areas across vastly different areas of the country, and also vast policy differences within those states themselves. So while we're experts, I do say we tend to be generalists. And so we do rely heavily on specialized experts, like I mentioned, the ones just before, to help fill in those gaps. And so, you know, like I said, we try to categorize things pretty broadly to find groups to help provide a fundamental understanding of what policies states have. And so if you look at post-election audits, we kind of have three categories that we go into. So first we have our traditional, so those look at a fixed percentage of voting districts or voting machines or perhaps even ballots then within said district. And so there are, again, vast differences in how states conduct this. For example, what exactly is counted? In Alaska, a randomly selected precinct in each House race is selected, and 5% of ballots cast in the district are audited. In Nevada, the audit looks at 2 or 3% of voting machines, depending on the county size. Another difference is who conducts the audit. New Mexico, they hire an independent auditor, they're hired by the Secretary of State, and they oversee the audit. Pennsylvania, the local boards of elections, so the county level, they do it. And I think in Vermont, the Secretary of State conducts the audit. So again, big differences there in who actually does it. And then lastly, when is the audit conducted? Jennifer kind of mentioned this in hers a little bit, but so in Florida, the audit is conducted following the certification of election results. So results certified, then they conduct the audit. In Illinois, they conduct theirs before the canvassing of ballots, so earlier in the process. Our next one we do is risk limiting audits, and I tried to find a simple definition for risk limiting audits, and I called it statistically based audit techniques. And I don't see any pitchforks or torches, so I'm assuming I'm at least somewhat correct. And so, as been mentioned, risk limiting audits will be mentioned heavily throughout today, tomorrow, and Colorado as well, so I won't discuss those too much. And then lastly, we kind of have our catch-all, ubiquitous category of other. And those are just ones, they don't kind of quite fit with other ones. So for an example, in Idaho, an audit is triggered only when a recount is required. And then there are some states, I think Michigan, for example, that do more of the procedural audit, so it's not necessarily a counting of the ballots themselves, but perhaps more of an audit of the election process and procedures. So again, the idea that if the process and the procedures were followed, that adds integrity or verifiability in the election itself. And they don't necessarily count ballots, which I'm sure some people are upset with here. But so that's another thing. What we have here is a kind of a graphic of what I just discussed. So in the kind of teal blue, we have those traditional audit states. The purple are risk limiting audits. The others are the orange or yellow-orange, and then the gray, as far as we know, there's no statutory requirement for an audit. And this is also on our webpage, which I will post later. You will see the gray states. There are some out there, just to point those out that they do exist. So there are a few interesting things happening in regards to state policy now in many states. So first we have Oregon and New Mexico, so kind of two states not often associated with each other, most likely, but both are categorized as traditional audits. However, what they actually do is they have enacted a tiered system. In a tiered system, the margin of victory of race dictates how many ballots need to be audited. So the closer the race, the more ballots that get audited. But they tend to still be a fixed percent. So if the margin of victory is 1%, that means you need to count X number of precincts. So that's, again, fixed, but a little bit different from just every county does the same. In California, they recently passed, in 2018 in September, actually not too long ago, Assembly Bill 2125, which stipulated that in lieu of the traditional audit beginning with the spring primary of 2020, a county can choose to conduct a risk-limiting audit. So it does look like California might be looking to kind of slowly phase in risk-limiting audits in the state.
The bill self-destructs after a year.
Oh, there you go. So it's, I guess, kind of a pilot then, in a sense?
There was already a pilot. I don't know what this is.
Okay, then it is what it is. We'll say it then. And then, oops, I kept Michigan in there. So actually first talk about Ohio and Washington, again, another unlikely duo. I kind of determined them as having optional risk limiting audits. So in Ohio, a 2017 Secretary of State directive recommended risk limiting audits be used by counties, but did not mandate them. And then in Washington, county auditors are able to choose one of 3 post-election audit methods, with a risk limiting audit being one of those. And lastly, so Michigan already highlighted up there. Actually, a pretty decent amount of action in the state this year. During the 2018 general election, the state ran a risk limiting audit pilot program in 3 cities. And kind of, not quite coincidentally, maybe on the ballot this year was ballot measure 18.3, which actually took a lot of election policies and wanted to enshrine them into the Constitution as rights. That measure has passed, and so risk limiting audits, or excuse me, post-election audits were one of the things that is now will be a right in the Michigan Constitution. As to how exactly that's going to shake out, I don't know, and I don't know if anyone else in the panel can speak to that later or anyone else in the room. I'm more than happy to listen and learn. And then this is just basically what I said, but just in case anyone comes back later and is wondering why those states are highlighted, here you go. So I'm kind of moving on to legislation itself. We have a legislation database that we track election bills, one of our tags being post-election audits. So the database runs from 2011 to the present. And so if you look over time, from 2011 to 2015, a pretty consistent number of bills being introduced in states, and these can be carryovers from previous sessions. And so, but if you looked at the number enacted, not a whole lot of action. However, once you jump to 2016, 2017, and 2018, you see a little bit more action and a little bit more of the enacted side. So 176 bills overall in that total time frame with, if I can, I need glasses, probably 24 enacted. Those kind of seem like fairly respectable numbers, but I decided to compare those to 2 other larger election topics that, and again, for the same time frame. So if you look at cybersecurity as another one of our tags, 433 bills with 59 enacted. And then if you look at voter ID, again, 973 bills with 131 enacted. Not to say every one of those bills is a blockbuster. They could be very minor nips and changes, tucks here and there. But again, I mean, post-election audits have been kind of consistent, but perhaps not as high as some other topics have in the field. And so again, I know we're going to talk about risk limiting audits a lot, but I thought I would kind of, the next 2 slides change a little bit, and I address it more to you guys, the audience. And so I think NCSL's mission and what we do are kind of in a unique position that consistently works not only with, but for state policymakers. And so I don't mean to try and speak on behalf of any legislators, and I don't know if there's any legislators here or legislative staff. I do know it's being live streamed. Oh, here we go. Excellent. Legislative staff, good. That's excellent. So one of our constituents here, happy to see that. So I'm not going to try and, I'm not going to pretend I represent every single legislator or legislative staff in the country, but I'm hoping I can provide a somewhat different perspective and maybe even a smidge of advice. So with risk limiting audits, I think there's kind of, to steal it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the good. There's plenty of Coloradans here, and I know Colorado will be discussed in depth. We know from them it's implementable. It is possible, and it's a possibility that states can undertake. Another good thing is, as everyone knows, the integrity, security, and confidence of the election, which is, of course, vital to our democracy as a whole, and so having a system such as this can help that. And lastly, there are potential cost and time savings compared to the more traditional audits if you conduct a risk limiting audit. The bad, not everyone is ready. So it's kind of been discussed that if you don't, like maybe you don't have the technology, which is my second point. There might be ways to conduct it, but a lot of states see the need to, well, states need new technology in voting anyways. But it could be a challenge for many states to get the funds to actually be able to requisition equipment. And there are initial costs and savings. Initial costs and time. I was speaking with Judge Cho earlier this week. He was at a meeting of one of ours down in DC, and I asked him what was the actual cost for Colorado's implementation of risk limiting audits. And he said, well, if you ignore the cost of purchasing new equipment, that's like me saying I'm a rich man if you ignore my student loans, right? It's, So there's, and certainly there's other costs for software he mentioned, but the ability to purchase new equipment is a large thing, and states looking to do that need to find funds at times where state budgets are not perhaps as robust as many people would like. And then kind of lastly, the ugly. The idea of legislation for the sake of legislation. Risk limiting audits are certainly a cool thing now, right? It's this kind of a trending topic in election policy. But I think most of us would agree that legislation and policy should be done through informed decisions. And so the idea of just let's get it in the books and see how it goes, perhaps it's not the best policy for states, and then for perhaps the poor administrators who then have to do it per state law. And then lastly, kind of I'm referring it to as magic, right? Risk limiting audits are decently complex. And so I had a very simple definition of statistically based audit techniques. If you were to go out on the street, and probably outside of the MIT campus, perhaps even more so, and you asked the average voter if they wanted to learn about statistically based audit techniques, how do you imagine that going, right? So if RLAs can provide confidence and integrity and security in the system, there is kind of the condition that people understand what exactly it is and why it provides that. And so I think what could be really detrimental to the policy of a risk limiting audit is people believing it happens by magic, right? You plug some numbers in the computer spits it all out, and things just go, right? And perhaps not fully understanding the underlying concepts or even just things like that. So I think that could be one of the ugly things about it. And then kind of some last comments, and I do have some of our resources on the right from NCSL. So treat legislators new to the topic. Maurice was there in Cheyenne, Wyoming. We were doing election security training for a regional-based states up there, and one legislator said, "I've never felt dumber in my life." So just remember, not all legislators are experts. So when if you go and talk with them, I'm not saying treat them like they perhaps don't know. You might find a very informed legislator, and they do exist out there, just to let everyone know. But when you go in there, start easy and see where they're at, and then go from there. And then muddling through. So I mentioned I have a master's in public administration. We talked about some of the theories of how policy gets advanced. And so Charles Lindblom was a political scientist, and he was an early advocator and proponent of what was termed muddling through, perhaps more politely known as incrementalism. And so it's the idea that public policy is made in small steps, not great leaps. And so if you're out there, again, speaking with legislators or talking to people, kind of a reminder that a small step toward a policy is still a step. And it is it's probably much more difficult to convince anyone, of taking a large leap rather than a small step. And then lastly, kind of neutral language. Although in legislation, sometimes specifics need to be made, the use of very technical or perhaps even kind of confining language can put states in a bind. Obviously, to be able to allow a state or state administrators, local election officials, some wiggle room in how they do that is certainly probably, I think many people would regard as a bonus to the system. In case something does not work, if the state doesn't quite have the technology right now, are they able to kind of shift a little bit and comply with state law and then still do it? Or is the state law just on the books, but they can't actually do it because there's no way around it? And so just kind of as incrementalism and muddling through is policy takes time to get where it's going. As much time as it takes to get the policy implemented, it takes just as much time to fix often enough. And so again, those are some resources we have, and I think I am all set.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. We started the panel a couple minutes late, so we have a little bit of time for questions now, and of course we have the rest of the event for folks to talk to the panelists. But if folks just want to raise their hands and
Can I jump
yes,
in with something first?
real fast.
Something that I keep hearing is this, like Colorado spent $1 gazillion to update their voting systems for the audit. Can you turn your microphone on? Oh, sorry. Colorado spent a lot of money on their uniform voting systems, and one of the criteria in selecting the voting system was not just the ability to do a risk-limiting audit, but the ability to do a ballot-level comparison audit. So this is kind of the Rolls-Royce or Bentley, voting system to make audits as efficient on audit day as possible. but the equipment that you need to be able to do an audit is paper ballots. You don't need anything beyond that. So the states that don't have paper can't do a risk limiting audit, but the states that do have paper just need to keep track of the paper. And most states could improve how they keep track of the paper. So that was one thing. The other thing is people are referring to Virginia as having a risk limiting audit. It has risk limiting in the name, but it isn't risk limiting. And one way you can tell that is that it doesn't happen until after certification. So it can't possibly overturn an election and correct an outcome. So it can't be a risk limiting audit.
Yes, we are under the policy generally that it's the legislators who are our constituents and help pay for us. Say it's a risk limiting audit, we tend to defer to them. So that is,
Okay, so we have,
that's
we
my
have
comment
about
on that.
7 minutes for Q&A. We ask people, because we are webcasting, if you raise your hand and then a microphone will be brought to you. The other thing, our request is if you could ask a question, that would be helpful, and try to make that questions short. So who has questions that they would like to ask of the panelists? Right here.
Super quick question. How did New Jersey do a risk limiting audit? Do they have paper anywhere?
They do. So they actually have 3 counties that were trying out some new.
Mike.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. They do. So they have 3 counties that had purchased a limited amount of new voting equipment. So in Gloucester County, they were using the ES&S Express Vote XL. And that was the same in Union County, and then in Essex County, they had the Dominion ICX with VVPAT. So that was, it provided a paper trail. It also, provided some challenges as well. So it was a super informative, thinking about the different configurations of voting systems. I spent a fair amount of time with both vendors, but particularly with ES&S, just so that we both had a common understanding of what it was that we wanted to get out of the CVR. Different terminology, different layout. In the end, we were able to translate what each other was saying, and they had the information that we needed. But I think pushing the common data standards is going to be really critical to making this more wide scale. But we did have paper artifacts that we were able to organize. And we did ballot comparison in the 2 ES&S counties, and then we did a ballot polling audit in the county with the VVPAT.
And I'll note that this afternoon Bob Giles will be on a panel, and folks can grill Bob about this and other things. Other questions?
The first 5 minutes of my presentation.
Bill. And also, if people could identify themselves so we can get to know people.
Yeah, Bill Cressy, Commissioner, Chicago Board of Elections. Dr. Stark, love your paper. I'm also a professor of auditing. So, but one thing, you talk about the costs involved, and you really have to think about the relative costs, because right now in Chicago, we have a state statute that requires a 5% audit, which costs a lot of money to hire a lot of people to come in before we can certify and count all those things. Now, in a risk limiting audit, from reading your paper, especially in a city like Chicago, where you'll have a candidate who'll get like 85 to 90% of the vote, it would seem that would be a lot less costly to run an RLA. Am I correct in that?
From the way you describe it, yes. My understanding in Colorado is that some LEOs were finding it was less work to do this than the statutory audit, which involved looking at 500 ballots.
Correct.
Okay, so relatively, as far as costs are concerned, this could be, in the long run, a much more economical choice, something especially good to the taxpayers.
It could immediately save money by redirecting effort where it matters. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I add something to that? So I think one of the other things we need to think about is we find a way to validate this and make this a common practice. How do we change the way we look at recounts? Because there are a number of states that do multiple recounts that are expensive and time consuming. And if we're saying that a risk limiting audit has the potential, if there are errors, to eventually lead to a recount, there is a way to satisfy both of those. But to start with the more efficient, looking at the ballots in a more efficient way versus just immediately assuming we've got to do a recount times whatever, times 5. And that was one of the ironies in Colorado is not in 2017, not only did we do perform a successful risk limiting audit, but then my staff had to turn around and we had to conduct 5 recounts immediately after. So we need to think about that if we want to really look at cost savings.
Just to give a rule of thumb, if your equipment does let you do ballot level comparison audits like Colorado's does and like most of the stuff that's currently modern, to get a risk limit of 5%, the number of ballots you need to look at is roughly 7 divided by the margin. So if you have a margin of 0.1%, that's 7,000 ballots. And many state recount laws kick in, at about that level. So 7,000 versus the entire state, assuming you don't find problems.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, Greg.
Greg Riddle-Moser from Stafford, Virginia. And it's kind of fun when you see 5 other hands go up and Charles counts on me. And I appreciate Jennifer talking about how election administrators need to work with the media and the scientists and things like that. But my question is, how is the scientists dealing with the fact that states have different laws for ballots? And what I mean specifically by that is, in Virginia, with recounts, we look at voter intent. On election day, we look at did the dot counter count dots. And so when you go into a recount, we had a statewide recount with 2.2 million ballots a while back with 1,200 ballots that got hand inspected. Only 1,200 out of 2.2 million, because you're looking for the person who circles the name instead of colored the dot. So when you're looking at those two paradigms, on election day, we don't count the person who doesn't follow the rules, if you will. But during a recount, we are very interested in the voter's intent on every one of those 2.2 million ballots.
Is that for me? Or
Anyone who wants to grab it.
Yep.
I think that's critical. That's one of the recommendations I've made is that voter intent guidelines need to be established statewide and they need to be used for both, right? So they should be the same set of guidelines that you're evaluating a ballot with during the election as well as during the audit.
If you want to know who people intended to elect, you need to look at voter intent in the audit and the recount. I mean, the question is, what question are you trying to answer? If you're trying to answer who really won, and your vote doesn't count because you circled it instead of put a dot in it, so that just absolutely doesn't count under any circumstances, then you don't count it. But if you have a voter intent law, that's what you follow in the audit.
And I think this will be an interesting question to pursue, say, this afternoon when we talk to Colorado and specifically how particular cases were dealt with. So good. Well, I do want to keep us more or less on schedule. So let's, first of all, thank the panel